tall, coarse-looking man. Bunchy apologised before he saw who they were. Then we swung round and he saw them. I felt his hand tighten suddenly, and I looked over his shoulder at them. The man's face had gone quite pale, and Mrs. Halkett Hackett looked very odd, frightened. I asked Bunchy who the man was, and he said, "Fella called Withers," in a frozen little voice. I said, "Don't you like him?" and he said, "Not much, my dear," and then began to talk about something else. Interesting. Anything more? Later on, Bunchy and I went to Chaperone's Corner. Your mother was there. Mrs. Halkett Hackett came up with her husband, and then the girl she's bringing out arrived with that old ass Carados. The girl had toothache, she said, but I'm afraid the wretched child was really not having a great success. General Halkett Hackett said he'd take the girl home, and Bunchy offered to take Mrs. Halkett Hackett home later on. The General thanked him, but she looked extraordinarily put out and seemed to me to avoid answering. There was one other thing. Evelyn Carados seemed very upset too, nothing to do with Bunchy. She looked ill. She kept clutching a great fat bag in her lap. Bunchy's hand touched Evelyn's bag, and she started as if he'd hurt her, and her fingers tightened. I could see them now, white, with highlights on the knuckles, dug into the gold stuff of the bag. I thought I'd like to paint them and call the thing Hands of a Frightened Woman. And then sometime after supper, when I danced again with Bunchy, I sat out with him in the ballroom. We were talking away when he suddenly stopped dead and stared over my shoulder. I turned and saw he was looking at Evelyn Carados. There was nothing much to stare at. Dmitri was giving her back that bag. I suppose she'd left it somewhere. What's the matter? That great fat bag you had noticed earlier. Yes, but it wasn't so fat this time, said Troy. It was quite limp and flat. Mildred came up and we left soon after that. I'm afraid that's all. Afraid? Troy, you don't know what an important person you are. Don't I? She looked at him with an air of bewildered friendliness, and at once his whole face was lit up by his fierce awareness of her. Troy's eyes suddenly filled with tears. She reached out her hand and touched him. "I'll go," she said. "So sorry." She went without another word. Detective Inspector Fox arrived, looking solid and respectable. "Good morning, sir," said Fox. "Hello, Fox. I found Lord Robert's notes on the blackmail case. There they are." Fox took the little notebook in his enormous fist. "Yes," he said when he had finished. "Well, now, that puts this Mr. Dmitri in a very unfavourable light." "See here," said Alain. "We've got to get the man or woman who overheard that call. What have you done?" "Our chaps arrived at Marsden House a quarter of an hour after the taxi got to the yard. Dmitri had left the house, but our chaps telephoned him at his flat to make sure he was there, and sent a plainclothes man round to watch it. They took statements from the men Dmitri had left to clear up, and we've located the room where Lord Robert rang you up, and sealed it. The men's cloakroom attendant was still there, managed to recollect most of the men who were the last to go, and I've got a list, likely incomplete, of the guests who left alone about the same time as Lord Robert." Fox handed a notebook to Alain, who read, "Mrs. Halkett Hackett, seen leaving alone, by footman at door, Dmitri and linkman, who offered to call a taxi for her. She refused and walked away. Lord Robert had not left. Captain Maurice Withers, seen leaving alone by Dmitri, footman, and several members of a party whom he passed on the steps outside the house, Lord Robert at foot of stairs. Mr. Donald Potter, seen saying goodbye to Miss O'Brien by Dmitri and by two servants near door into buffet. Sir Daniel Davidson, seen leaving alone immediately after this by Dmitri and two of the servants. Miss Violet Harris, secretary to Lady Carados, seen leaving alone by cloakroom attendant standing at door, unnoticed by anyone else. Mr. Trelawney Caper, young gentleman described by footman as being nicely decorated but not drunk. Lord Robert Gospel. Both footman and a linkman saw him go. Cloakroom attendant says it was about 2 minutes after Miss Harris." Alain looked up. "Where was Dmitri then?" "He said he went into the buffet about the time Sir Daniel left and was kept there for some time. The rest left some time after Lord Robert." "When did the Carados party go? Last of all, of course." "Yes. For all we know, it may not have been any of the guests or Dmitri." "True. All the same, it's not easy to fit an outsider into what facts we've got. An unknown in full evening dress stands outside Marsden House. He doesn't know when Lord Robert will leave, so he has to hang about for 3 hours. He doesn't know whether Lord Robert will leave in a party or alone. He doesn't know a heavy mist's going to crawl over London at 1 o'clock. I think when the murderer went out from the house, he knew that Bunchy was returning alone. He may have seen him alone in the hall. Your little list is important. The telephone rang. Alain answered. Hello? Mr. Alain, the Yard here. Sir Daniel Davidson's rung up and says he may have something to tell you. He'll be in all day. Say I'll call at 2 o'clock, thank him. Alain put the receiver down. Have you finished here, sir? Yes, I got here at 5. Broke the news to Lady Mildred and settled down to Lord Robert's dressing-room, bedroom and this study. From 7 until 10 I looked in their garden and the neighbouring gardens for a cloak and a soft hat. No success. I've got a squad of men at it now. He may not have got rid of them. No, he may have been afraid of leaving some trace of himself. If that's the case, he'll want to destroy them. What sort of house is Dimitri's? A small 2-room flat in the Cromwell Road. We'll go round there at noon when he's due at the Yard and see if we can't find anything. Fox, go and do your stuff with the maids. Don't disturb Lady Mildred, but ask for Mr. Donald's telephone number. Fox returned in a few minutes. Sloane 8405. Alain reached for the telephone and dialed the number. I want you to trace Sloane 8405 at once, please. I'll hang on. He waited. What? Said Alain suddenly. Yes, thank you. Goodbye. He put back the receiver. Mr. Donald Potter's telephone number is that of Captain Maurice Withers, Sling Street, Chelsea. Captain Maurice Withers appears in Lord Robert's notes. He was at the cocktail party at Mrs. Halkett Hackett's. He was at the concert when Dimitri took her bag. Now look at this. Alain took a checkbook from the desk and handed it to Fox. Look at the heel of the book. Turn up June 8th last Saturday. Fox found it. £50. M. Withers. D. Shackleton House, Leatherhead. Fox returned to Lord Robert's notes. What Sissy says about Captain Withers being mixed up in a drug affair in 1924. It was rather in my salad days at the Yard, Fox, but I remember. The Bouchier-Watson lot had their headquarters at Marseille and Port Said, but they operated all over the shop, heroin mostly. The FO took a hand. Bunchy was there and helped us enormously. Captain Withers was undoubtedly up to his nasty neck in it, but we never quite got enough to pull him in. And young Donald's flown to him for sanctuary. Besotted young ninny. The door was suddenly flung open and Donald walked into the room. His eyes were bloodshot and his face pallid. Where's my mother? Alain said. Agatha Troy's looking after her. I want to speak to you. I want to see my mother. You'll have to wait, said Alain. Donald Potter sat on a chair facing the window. Alain was at Lord Robert's desk. Fox sat in the window, his notebook on his knee. When did you last speak to your uncle? About 10 days ago. When did you leave this house? On the same day, said Donald breathlessly. What was the trouble, your debts? Yes. Did he pay them? Yes. Then why did you quarrel? He wanted me to go to Edinburgh to take my medical. I wanted to go to Thomas's. Did he know you were acquainted with Captain Maurice Withers? Donald darted a glance of profound astonishment at Alain. He knew I was friendly with Withers, yes. Did he object to this friendship? He did say something, now I come to think about it. Alain brought his hand down sharply on Lord Robert's cheque-book. Then I take it you have forgotten a certain cheque for £50. A dull flush mounted to the roots of Donald's hair. No, he said. I remember. Did he pay this amount to Withers on your behalf? Yes. Why were you in debt to Withers? Was it a bet? Yes. Horses? Yes, said Donald quickly. There's something else, said Alain. Donald, how else did you lose money to Captain Withers? Donald knit his brows. I don't know what to do, he said naively. You have made some promise to Withers. Is that it? Yes. The young men of your generation are rather bewildering. I swear I would never have been taken in by a flashy gentleman with no occupation, unless running an illicit hole-and-corner casino may be called an occupation. I never mentioned roulette, said Donald in a hurry. It is indeed a shame to take your money, rejoined Alain. Fox gave a curious little cough and turned a page of his notebook. Very well, said Alain. When did you hear of this tragedy? This morning, when the sporting edition came in. Why were you so long coming here? I wasn't dressed, and though you may not believe it, I got a great shock when I heard of my uncle's death. No doubt. So did your mother. I wonder she didn't ring you up. The telephone's disconnected, said Donald. I forgot to pay the bloody bill. Wits left it to me. I rang her from a call box. I see. Fox, ask one of our men to go and tell Captain Withers I shall call on him in a few minutes and will be obliged if he remains indoors. Very good, Mr. Alleyne, said Fox, and went out, coming back shortly. Now then, Alleyne continued, I understand you were among the last to leave Marsden House this morning. I want you to tell me exactly what happened just before you left. I was with Bridget O'Brien. Uncle Bunch was there in the hall. Did you speak to him? No. I wish to God I had. I think I heard him asking people if they'd seen Mrs. Halkett Hackett. Captain Withers was not at the ball? Yes, but he'd gone. Wits was going on somewhere. He had a date. Do you know where he went and with whom? No. When you left Marsden House, what did you do? Some people were waiting outside for a taxi, asked me to go on with them to the sauce boat, but I didn't want to. I walked to the corner to look for a taxi. There wasn't one, so I walked. I was thinking about Bridget, and Uncle Bunch, and everything. Presently I was on the King's Road, so I just walked home. Did you meet anyone? I didn't notice. What time did you get home? I didn't notice. Alleyne looked gravely at him. I want you, please, to try very hard to remember if you met anybody on that walk, particularly just after you left Marsden House. If you are innocent, you are in no danger unless you prevaricate or shift ground, particularly in matters relating to your acquaintance with Captain Withers. You can't suspect Withers. It's got nothing to do with him. In that case, he has nothing to fear. On that account, of course he hasn't. I mean... Oh, hell. Where were you when you lost this money to him? In a private house somewhere near Leatherhead. Shackleton House, it's called. Was it his house? Ask him. Why do you badger me with all of this? I can't stand any more. Let me out of this. You may go, certainly. There will be a statement for you to sign later on. Donald got up and faced Alleyne. I'm as anxious as you, he said, that the man should be caught. Naturally. I'm as anxious as anybody. Good, said Alleyne. Donald's face was puckered into the sort of grimace a small boy makes when he's trying not to cry. For some reason this gave him a strong look of his uncle. Alleyne took him roughly by the arm. There, he said, if you're innocent, you're safe. As for this other mess you've got yourself into, stick to the truth, and we'll do what we can for you. Now march. He turned Donald round, shoved him through the door, and slammed it behind him. Come on, Fox. Ring up the yard and tell them to look Withers up in the record. And if one of my men is free, send him straight off to Shackleton House, Leatherhead. The report on the post-mortem was ready. Fox took it down over the telephone, and he and Alleyne discussed it on their way to Sling Street. Dr. Curtis says there's no doubt that he was suffocated. They found Tardio's ecchymosis on the lungs and on the heart. There were also signs of fatty degeneration in the heart. They seemed to think that that would make everything more rapid. Has Curtis any idea what was used? Possibly a plug of soft material introduced into the mouth and held over the nostrils. I found a trace of fine black woolen fluff in the mouth. The cloak? Looks like it. By the way, Fox, did you get a report from the PC in Belgrave Square last night? Yes. Nothing suspicious. The door of 110 was opened by Captain Withers himself. Alleyne and Fox found themselves in a mass-produced furnished sitting room. It smelt of hair-wash, cigars, and whiskey. On one wall hung a framed photograph of the sort advertised in magazines as artistic studio studies from the nude. On a table by the divan bed against the wall were 3 or 4 medical textbooks. Withers was the sort of man who breathes vulgarity. His neck was too thick, his fingers too flat and pale, and his hair shone too much, yet, in spite of these defects, he was a powerful animal. Alleyne, by contrast, looked fine-drawn, a cross between a monk and a grandee. The planes of his face and head were emphatically defined, and there was a certain austerity in the chilly blue of his eyes and in the blackness of his hair. Withers lit a cigarette, blew the smoke down his nose, and said, "What's it all about?" Fox produced his official notebook. I want to ask you one or two questions about the early hours of this morning, Alain said. When did you leave Marston House? After the ball was over. Did you leave alone? Yes. Can you remember who was in the hall when you went away? Dan Davidson. Is Sir Daniel Davidson a friend of yours? Not really, I just know him. Did you notice Lord Robert in the hall as you left? Can't say I did. Did you take a taxi? No. My car was parked in Belgrave Road. Did you see any solitary man in evening dress as you walked to Belgrave Road? I don't remember. It was misty. Where did you go in your car? To the Matador. The nightclub in Sampler Street. Did you meet anybody there? Yes. May I have her name? No. I shall have to find out by the usual routine, murmured Alain. Make a note of it, will you, Fox? Perhaps your partner was waiting in your car, Captain Withers. Are you sure you did not drive her there? All right, said Withers. I did drive my partner to the Matador, but I shan't give you her name. Have you any medical knowledge? No. I see some textbooks over there by the bed. They don't belong to me. To Donald Potter? That's right. Do you consider that you have a strong influence over Mr. Potter? I'm not a bear leader. You prefer fleecing lambs, perhaps? Captain Withers, do you recollect the Bouchier-Watson drug-running affair of 1924? No. I'm reminded of it this morning by certain notes left by Lord Robert Gospel. He mentions the case in connection with recent information he gleaned about an illicit gambling club at Leatherhead. The coarse white hands made a convulsive movement which was immediately checked. There is only one other point, Alain said. I believe your telephone is disconnected. Inspector Fox, will you go to the post office at the corner? Wait a second. Alain took out his notebook, scribbled, "Get Thompson to tail W at once," and showed it to Fox. Give that message, will you, and see that Captain Withers' telephone is reconnected immediately. As soon as it's through, ring me here. Fox left, and Alain said, When your telephone is working again, I would be glad if you would ring up Mr. Donald Potter to suggest that as his mother is in great distress, you think it would be well if he stayed with her for the time being. Alain walked over to the divan bed and looked at the books. He ruffled the pages of a large blue volume. Here we have the fullest information on asphyxia. May I borrow this book? I'll return it to Mr. Potter. I've no objection. Splendid. Have you any objection to my looking at your dress clothes? None. Withers walked into the bedroom and Alain followed him. The only item of interest was a row of paper-bound banned novels of peculiar indecency and no literary merit. Withers threw a tailcoat, a white waistcoat, and a pair of trousers on the bed. Alain turned out the pockets, which were empty. Had you a cigarette case? He asked. Yes. May I see it? It's in the next room. Withers went into the sitting room. Alain, with a cat-like swiftness, looked under the bed and in at a cupboard door. Withers produced a small flat silver case. The inside lid was inscribed, Morris from Estelle. Alain returned it and took another from his pocket. Will you look at this, please, and tell me if you've seen it before? Withers took it. It was a thin, smooth gold case, but with a small crest in one corner. Do you know it? No. It is not Mr. Donald Potter's, for instance. Isn't his? The telephone rang in the next room. It was Fox, to say in an extremely low voice that Thompson was well on his way. Splendid. Captain Withers wanted to use it at once. Alain hung up the receiver and turned to Withers. Now, please, he said, telephone Mr. Potter. Withers dialed the number with bad grace. Hello, Don, it's Wits. I rang up to say I thought it might be as well if you stayed with your mother for a bit. She'll want you there with all this trouble. I'll send your things around. Yes, but listen, Wits, about the house at... Captain Withers rang off. Thank you, said Alain. Can you remember what Lord Robert was saying on the telephone when you walked into the room at 1 o'clock this morning? I never heard him on any telephone. Were you on the top landing near the telephone room around about 1 o'clock? The devil should I know? I was up there quite a bit. Alone? No, I was there with Don sometime during the supper dances. We were in the first sitting-out room. Old Carados was up there then. Did you hear anyone using a telephone? Fancy I did. Ah, well. That's the best we can do for the moment, I suppose, said Alain. By the way, would you object to my searching these rooms just to clear your good name, you know? You can crawl over them with a microscope if you like. I see. Thank you very much. Some other time, perhaps. Good morning. Fox was waiting outside the post office. "We'd better take a taxi to Dimitri's," Alain said. "What time was he to be at the yard?" "Midday. It's 11:45. Come on." They got a taxi. "How about Withers?" asked Fox. "He's the right height to within an inch, but if he's got anything to hide, it's at the house at Leatherhead. I've got his nasty flat prints on my own cigarette case. We'll see if he's handled Donald Potter's book on medical jurisprudence, particularly the sections that deal with suffocation and asphyxia. Hello, one arrived." The taxi had pulled up at a respectable old apartment house in the Cromwell Road. Alain slid back the glass partition and addressed the driver. "We're police officers. In a minute or two a man will come out of this house and want a cab. Hang about for him. He will probably ask you to drive him to Scotland Yard. If he gives you any other address, I want you to write it quickly on this card while he's getting into the cab. Drop the card through the gear lever slit in the floor. Right you are, Governor. I want you to turn your car and drive 200 yards up the road and let us out. Then wait for your man. Here's your fare and all the rest of it." "Thank you, sir. Okay, sir," said the taximan. He did as Alain had requested, and they got out. The taxi turned once more. They heard the driver's hoarse, "Taxi, sir," heard him pull up, heard the door slam, heard the cab drive away. "He hasn't dropped his card," said Alain, turning to stare after the taxi. "Now then, Fox, give me a few minutes in that flat and then ring up, as if from the yard, and keep Dimitri's servant on the telephone as long as possible. Then away with you to the yard. Keep Dimitri going until I come. Arrange to have him tailed when he leaves." Alain returned to Dimitri's flat. The door was opened by a thin, dark man who exuded quintessence of waiter. "Is Mr. Dimitri in?" asked Alain. "Monsieur has just left, sir. May I take a message?" "What a bore, I've just missed him. I'm Chief Inspector Alain. Here's my card. May I come in?" He found himself in a sitting-room that had an air of wearing a touch of black satin at the neck and wrists, but was otherwise unremarkable. "You will have guessed," Alain began, "that I'm here on business connected with the death of Lord Robert Gospel." "Yes, sir." "What is your name?" "François, sir. François Dupont." "Were you at Marsden House last night?" "Yes, sir. An important member of our staff failed Mr. Dimitri yesterday afternoon, and I took his place." "Where were you stationed?" A telephone rang in the entrance passage. "Excuse me, sir," said the servant. The man went out, closing the door behind him. Alain darted into an adjoining bedroom, leaving the door ajar. He moved with swiftness and extreme precision. There was no hiding place anywhere for a bulky cloth cloak. Alain returned to the sitting-room. He could hear the servant's voice. "Yes, sir. Yes, that is quite correct. It is as Monsieur Dimitri says, sir. We returned together at 3:30 in a taxi." "At 3:30. "No, sir, no. At 3:30. "Your colleague is here. He is about to ask me all these questions himself. He has given me his card. It is, the Chief Inspector Alain." "Ah, mon Dieu, mon Dieu." Alain went into the passage. "Is it for me?" Alain addressed the telephone. "Hello, it's Alain here. I've missed Mr. Dimitri, but will come along as soon as possible. Will you ask him to wait? Apologize for me." "I hope there was time. I'll get along to the yard now," Fox said. "Very well, that's perfectly all right," said Alain, and rang off. He returned to the sitting-room, followed by François. "A slight misunderstanding," explained Alain blandly. "To resume, you were going to tell me where you were stationed last night." "By the top landing, sir." "What are the rooms on this gallery?" "At the stairhead one finds a green baize door leading to servants' quarters, the back stairs, and so on. Next to this, a room which last night was employed as a sitting room. One finds next a bathroom, bedroom, and toilet used last night for the ladies. At the end of the gallery, a green boudoir also used as a sitting room for the ball." "Was there a telephone in any of these rooms?" "In the green boudoir, sir. It was used several times during the evening." "You're an excellent witness, François. Now tell me, do you remember the names of the persons who used the telephone?" It was used by a young gentleman who called a toll number to say that he would not be returning to the country. Early in the evening it was answered by Sir Daniel Davidson. He spoke about a patient who had had an operation. It was also used by Lord Robert Gospel. Could you hear what Lord Robert said? No, sir. Did you notice if anyone went into the room while Lord Robert was on the telephone? No, sir. Immediately after Lord Robert entered this room, Sir Herbert Carrados came out of the other sitting room and spoke to me about the lack of matches. I fetched some more from downstairs, and when I returned, the telephone room was empty. Alain sighed. Now, François, who was in the other sitting room, and who was on the landing before Lord Robert telephoned? Can you remember? There were two gentlemen. One of them asked me to fetch 2 whiskies and sodas, and I obtained their drinks using the back stairs. When I returned, Lord Robert Gospel had just come up the stairs, and when they saw him, these 2 gentlemen moved into the first sitting room. Do you mean that they seemed to avoid him? I received that impression, sir. Can you describe them? One, sir, was a man perhaps 50 years of age, a big man with a red face and thick neck. The other was a young gentleman, dark, rather nervous. He danced repeatedly with Miss Bridget O'Brien. Any others? The little mademoiselle, the secretary, who was known to few, retired often to the gallery. Sir Daniel Davidson, the physician, came upstairs. That was before Lord Robert appeared. It was for Lady Carrados he inquired, but she had gone downstairs. I told Sir Daniel this, and he returned downstairs. Now, for the rest of the evening, did you see Lord Robert again? No, sir. I remained on the top landing until the guests had gone. I then took a tray to Monsieur in the butler's pantry. Was this long after the last guest had left? No, sir. I fancy there may have been 1 or 2 left in the hall. Monsieur was in the buffet when I came down. Was Sir Herbert Carrados in the buffet? He left as I entered. When did you go home? At 3:30 with Monsieur. Right. I think that is all. You've been very helpful and obliging. François took his tip with a waiter's grace and showed Alain out. In his room at the yard, Alain smiled pleasantly at Dimitri and thought, not a good head. Everything's a bit too narrow. No fool, though. We're anxious to get a little information about a small green boudoir on the top gallery at Marsden House. It has a telephone in it. Did you at any time visit this room? Repeatedly. I inspect all the rooms continually. The time in which we are interested is about 1 o'clock this morning. Dimitri removed his rimless eyeglass and began to turn it between the fingers and thumb of his left hand. I learnt that about this time you returned Lady Carrados's bag to her. Dimitri suddenly put his hands in his pockets, the left hand still busy with the eyeglass. That is correct. The bag was in the room you mentioned. Anybody there? My servant, François. I trust there was nothing missing from this bag, asked Dimitri. Her ladyship, said Alain, has made no complaint. The point is this. At 1 o'clock, Lord Robert telephoned from this little green room. My informant tells me that you were on the landing. Your informant is misinformed. I did not see Lord Robert on this gallery. I did not notice him until he was leaving. He inquired if I had seen Mrs. Halkett Hackett. I informed his lordship that she had left. I then went to the buffet on the ground floor. I remained there for a time, speaking to Sir Herbert Carrados. Alain took a piece of paper from his pocketbook and handed it to Dimitri. This is the order of departure amongst the last guests. Would you mind glancing at it? Dimitri surveyed the list. It is correct as far as I can remember up to the time I left the hall. I believe you saw the encounter at the foot of the stairs between Lord Robert and his nephew, Mr. Donald Potter. It was scarcely an encounter. They did not speak. Did you get the impression that they avoided each other? Yes. I believe you attended the Bach recital in the Constant Street Hall on the 3rd of June. Did you happen to notice Lord Robert at this concert? I think I do remember his lordship was present. I pay little attention to externals when I listen to beautiful music. Did you return her bag to Mrs. Howell?